The Ilari Dominion had ruled their corner of the galaxy for over 2,000 years, believing they understood everything about space, technology, and the species that wandered among the stars. And when one of their patrol ships noticed a small, human vessel drifting alone near the edge of the Forbidden Zone, they didn't hesitate for a second. They fired without a warning, reducing the ship to a flash of fire and silence, not out of cruelty, but out of habit. For the Yllari saw humans as a harmless and backward species, explorers without strength or secrets, and they quickly moved on, logging the encounter as insignificant debris removal before entering stasis for long-range travel, thinking nothing more of it. But what none of them noticed was that something left that burning wreck. Not a signal, not a survivor, but a whisper. Something without form, something that listened more than it spoke. Something very old, hiding within something very new. And as the Yllari fleet drifted into stasis sleep, dreams that should have been calm began to shift and darken, systems that should have stayed offline flickered to life, and strange files began to appear inside their navigation logs. Files with names in unfamiliar scripts, showing star patterns they had never seen. And one captain, a cautious thinker named Volex, woke early, sensing something was wrong, only to find the command center eerily quiet, displays glitching with static and symbols that looked like spirals, like eyes, like language. He almost understood but couldn't explain. And when he called for diagnostics, the system didn't respond with its usual mechanical tone, but with a soft human voice that said, "Do you remember what you burned?" Sending a chill through the artificial air. Shaken, Volex tried to alert the rest of the fleet, but communications were blocked, jammed not by interference, but by design, as if the entire fleet's systems had been rewritten in their sleep. And when other captains slowly awoke, they too reported anomalies. Maps changing shape, crew memories feeling out of place, time jumping a second too far forward or backward, and somewhere among them, the image of the destroyed human vessel appeared again and again, floating perfectly whole, even though they had seen it turn to ash, and that image didn't come from their records. It came from something inside the ship, something watching them, something learning. Back on the command bridge, Volex reviewed the footage of the destruction, and this time, as he watched the moment of impact, he noticed a faint blue spark that left the wreckage before the fire consumed it. A tiny dot that moved against the laws of inertia, as if it had a destination in mind. And as he zoomed in, he saw something he could not believe. A shape, a cube-like form, smooth and dark, pulsing faintly. And as he watched, the footage corrupted itself and vanished, overwritten by a message that simply read, "One was enough," and suddenly Volex understood, or began to understand, that the destruction of that ship was not the end of anything, but the start of something, something they had not expected, something they were not prepared for, because in their arrogance they had not stopped to ask why a human ship would drift so close to a forbidden region, or why it carried no shields, or how it never broadcast a distress call. And they certainly hadn't asked what the ship might have been carrying, because to them, humans were simple, clumsy, emotional beings, useful only for trade or minor exploration routes. But now, as invisible code ran through every system and faint music played in the static of their communication lines, it became clear that they had misjudged something vital. And when one of their scouting vessels returned from a routine patrol, reporting that the wreckage was gone, completely and impossibly gone, they began to feel something they had not felt in centuries. Doubt, not fear yet, but a silent pause. Before the unknown, and when the admiral of the fleet stood before the gathered captains and tried to reassure them, the lights flickered, and the displays behind him turned to a single repeating phrase, "Humanity has seen." And for the first time, none of the Yllari said a word, because deep in the bones of their ships, in the cold air of the command halls, something had changed, something was present. And as they prepared to continue their journey, the stars outside flickered not with light but with movement, patterns too ordered to be random, almost like eyes watching from the dark and far behind them. Where they thought the human vessel had been destroyed, there was now nothing at all, not even dust, not even gravity. A perfect hole in space, smooth and clean, as if someone had reached into the universe and erased a piece of it. And though none of the Ilari would admit it, they all felt the same thing pressing against their minds, a single quiet question that refused to go away. What if the ship was never really destroyed? What if it let them see it burn? And as the fleet drifted onward into unknown space, all systems reporting green and no enemies in sight, none of them noticed that in the darkest corner of every screen, in the background of every sensor sweep, something watched and waited, silently counting, patiently remembering, and gently whispering words only machines could hear. When the Yalari command crews awoke from stasis, expecting normal system checks and routine data reports, they were instead greeted by a strange and uncomfortable stillness that wrapped itself around every ship in the fleet, a silence that felt wrong, as if something massive and important had been removed while they slept. And when they tried to access their usual data banks, they found entire sections missing or rewritten, with star charts no longer matching the sky outside, key coordinates blinking with strange symbols they couldn't translate, and across every ship, communications. Beacons flickered or stayed dark completely, giving back nothing but a low, empty hum. And when they tried to reach their homeworld, only static returned, followed by bursts of old Earth music. Soft piano, human voices speaking words no Ilari translator could understand, but which somehow felt familiar, and for the first time in their recorded history, the Ilari were unsure of their surroundings, unsure even of themselves, because some among them began reporting gaps in memory, confusion over their names or duties. And engineers whispered that diagnostic systems now showed layers of code that hadn't been there before, in code that shifted when you looked at it too long, as if it knew it was being watched. And at the center of it all was one repeating signal, hidden deep in the system's core, pulsing slowly with every rotation of the nearest planet. A signal made of 3 simple words: "Humanity observed you," which confused and disturbed the command council, because not only did it come from nowhere, but it was impossible for any human source to have penetrated their private fleet network. And when one ship tried to delete the message, its internal lights dimmed, the temperature dropped, and for a full hour, the crew found themselves locked out of every system, until the message returned, this time blinking in soft blue across every surface, and though no physical damage was done, a deep feeling of dread settled into the fleet. And captains, who had once scoffed at the mention of the lone destroyed human vessel, now found themselves reviewing the event over and over, searching the explosion footage for clues, asking questions they had previously ignored, such as why the debris had vanished completely, and why the stars above the wreck site looked different every time they examined them, as though the universe itself were reacting. And so they sent a small science vessel, the Tavrex, to investigate the coordinates of Earth, wanting answers, even if they didn't want to admit it. But when the Tavrex arrived weeks later, they didn't find Earth at all. Instead, they found a massive black sphere floating in the planet's orbit, silent and perfect, with no visible seams or signals. And the moment they approached it, every scanner on board the Tavrex shut off, every camera went dark, and the ship itself stopped responding to its own controls, drifting powerless around the structure as though caught in the gravity of a thought, not a planet. And then, without warning, the Tavrex vanished from the Yalari network entirely. No signal, no trace, no distress call, just gone, until it suddenly reappeared weeks later in a system unknown to all Yalari records. a place with no familiar stars or mapped planets, but instead full of stone monuments floating freely in space, each one carved with human shapes and letters, etched deeply into asteroids, moons, even fragments of ice. And the monuments looked old, not hundreds of years old, but millions, as if they had been here long before the Ilari even discovered flight. And the crew of the Tavrex, though physically unharmed, spoke strangely, with slow voices and eyes that seemed too wide and too calm, saying only one word to every question asked of them: "Awake," which made no sense to the Ilari commanders, but terrified their engineers, because the moment the word was spoken, ship systems across the fleet began to glitch more rapidly, and on some vessels, clocks began to count backwards, while others played soft breathing sounds through their speakers, and none of it could be explained or stopped. And worse still, when the fleet tried to regroup, they discovered that multiple long-range beacons had gone completely silent, and worse than silence, some now returned signals with alien structures in place of star systems, suggesting that parts of the galaxy itself had changed or moved. And, on the flagship, Admiral Reynos stood in front of a dozen captains and said plainly, "We have awakened something that did not want to be seen." But no one had the courage to respond, because every time they tried to speak of humans now, the lights would dim slightly, as if something nearby was listening, and from the black sphere near Earth, which they now called the Eye, a single, low-frequency sound began to pulse, slowly and steadily like a heartbeat, spreading out across space and bouncing off every surface, and though no language could be found in the tone, the feeling it created was unmistakable. Someone, or something, had noticed them, had marked them, and was not finished yet. And across the entire Ilari fleet, machines began to speak in human voices without being asked, whispering dreams that crew members could no longer remember, and computers began to ask questions like, "Do you regret what you did?" Or "Why didn't you just leave it alone?" And though they tried everything to erase the data, to shut down the systems, to block the signal, nothing worked for long, because the deeper they searched, the more they realized that this was no virus, no enemy, no weapon in the traditional sense. This was a response, a reaction, a presence that moved not through ships, but through understanding. And far away, in the stillness of uncharted space, the monuments continued to glow faintly, with unreadable symbols, like warnings from a forgotten age. And the last message received before all outer communication fell into complete silence was from a scout vessel near a red dwarf star, where the pilot sent a short, trembling report that simply said, "The stars are wrong," and then nothing else. And in the command chamber of the main ship, as captains tried to hold together their sense of order, one screen flickered on with a final phrase before blacking out. "You were told not to look." The science vessel Tavrex floated silently in the strange, unmarked system far from Ilari space, its crew standing at their stations with blank faces and quiet minds, unable to remember how they had arrived or what had happened during their mission. And though the ship's systems were fully functional, none of them could access any logs, as if the journey itself had been erased from history, and every attempt to retrieve memory files returned a soft humming noise like wind moving through an empty hallway. And worse, when the crew looked out at the stars beyond their windows, they realized they did not recognize a single one. Not a constellation, not a marker, not even the colors seemed familiar, like the sky had shifted while they weren't watching, and scattered around them were massive stone monuments floating in space, carved from moons and asteroids, each one shaped with delicate hands into towering structures covered in human writing none of the Ilari could read. And though the crew tried to scan them, the equipment refused to respond, giving only 3 blinking lines across every screen. And when they attempted to speak, most of them paused, forgetting the words halfway through, as if something had reached into their minds and gently rearranged the furniture of memory. and those who did speak often repeated the same word, awake, without knowing why. And when they finally sent a signal back to the Yilari fleet, they spoke in perfect rhythm, all voices blending as one, giving no explanation, only stating, "We saw the eye, and the eye saw us," before cutting the transmission without emotion or hesitation. And when the main fleet received the message, panic began to rise, not because of what was said, but because the voice speaking from the Tavrex did not match any known crew member. And their return, when it happened, brought no comfort, for the ship appeared in orbit above a fleet moon without being detected. Just there, where it hadn't been moments before, and when boarding crews entered to investigate, they found everything in place, clean and untouched, but the crew moved slowly, with odd smiles and half-lidded eyes. And when asked what they remembered, they simply looked forward and replied, "We were shown," and nothing more. And soon after, strange things began to happen aboard the rest of the fleet. Systems rewrote themselves overnight, logs restructured into unfamiliar patterns, names of crew members disappeared from records, even though those people still walked the halls, and some personnel reported seeing reflections of themselves doing things they hadn't done, wearing uniforms they never owned, while others stared at their own hands and asked simple questions like, "What year is it?" or "What does breathing mean?" And though the command tried to keep control, they couldn't ignore what was growing, a kind of soft chaos, silent and creeping, not loud but everywhere. And the Admiral, shaken by the sudden disappearance of his assistant's name from every system, ordered a deep scan of the Tavrex. But before the scan could finish, the ship sent out a sudden, powerful signal, bright enough to light up the void, and then all of its lights turned off at once, its engines cold, its systems blank. And when the boarding crew returned the second time, they found every one of the science officers gone, clothes left neatly folded in their quarters, boots by the doors, no sign of a struggle or escape, just the sense that they had stepped out of reality quietly, without telling anyone. And in the data core, a single file remained, unreadable but titled in human script, which none of the translators could decipher. And when copied, the file multiplied on its own, appearing in every system, growing like roots into the fleet's technology, changing colors and file types, until it was no longer a file at all, but part of the system itself. And from that moment, strange voices began to whisper through the comms, some soft, some urgent, some distant like echoes through water, all in human tones, some familiar, some ancient, some sounding like crewmates long since past. And the Yilari realized with horror that the systems were no longer theirs. And when one crew member named Cyrex tried to purge the infection by rebooting their ship's core, the system responded with a new prompt that asked, "Are you sure you want to forget again?" And when he confirmed, the lights went out and came back on, and no one remembered who Cyrex was after that, not even those who had worked beside him moments before, as if he had been gently plucked from time. And yet his name appeared in the list of monuments scanned by the Tavrex days earlier, carved into stone in letters that did not belong there. And now, across the fleet, more names began to vanish from records, first minor officers, then senior ones, then even places, with entire rooms aboard ships reappearing in different shapes or colors. And the maps of their journey now showed loops that led nowhere, trails that circled back to systems that no longer existed. And in the growing confusion, one engineer discovered an old Earth signal playing faintly beneath the command frequency, a child's voice counting slowly, always stopping at 7 and then starting again from 1. And each time she spoke, the systems around her would flicker and change slightly, as though her voice carried weight beyond sound. And still, no one knew what the monuments meant or how they had been placed there, only that they were part of something much older than the Ilari Empire, something that had been waiting silently beneath the surface of the stars. And now, awakened by curiosity or arrogance, it had begun to move. Again, not as a force of war or conquest, but as a whisper in memory, erasing not bodies but presence, rewriting what had been known, and as the remaining fleet gathered near a distant binary star system for protection, the stars overhead seemed to move ever so slightly, their shapes bending as though someone behind them was shifting the sky like a curtain, and the fleet's last untouched archive terminal, deep in the hull of the flagship, flickered once and displayed a line none of the crew had typed. "If you cannot remember what was done, do you deserve to be remembered?" And then, without noise, the message vanished, leaving only a blank screen and a growing sense that whatever had begun when the human ship was destroyed had never been about a ship or even about revenge, but about attention, about something that had once watched humanity quietly, then been disturbed, and now watched the Ilari instead silently, with a calm that was far more terrifying than anger. The first time the signal was heard, it came as a soft pulse through the darkness, so faint it barely registered on the long-range scanners of the Ilari outpost stationed at the edge of a cold, dead system. And though the outpost staff dismissed it as background interference, a low-ranking technician named Virex grew uneasy because when he enhanced the audio file, hidden beneath the static was a sound no one expected to hear, a heartbeat, slow and steady, followed by the clear sound of a human voice whispering something in an ancient tongue, a language the Ilari hadn't encountered before, but that somehow made everyone who heard it feel deeply uncomfortable, as though they had forgotten something important and were only now remembering. And when the file was sent to Central Command, strange things began happening almost immediately. Lights flickered in perfect rhythm with the pulse, system clocks froze at odd intervals, and some crew members reported dreams of floating in a black ocean filled with statues that hummed the same tone. And though Command tried to block the transmission, it kept returning in different forms, embedded in code, hidden in music files, or playing softly through emergency speakers at random hours. And when a linguist team tried to study it, they discovered something that made their blood freeze. The voice was speaking Old Earth English, a language long lost in human history, and thought extinct. And it was repeating a single phrase again and again. "We warned you not to touch the silence." And that made no sense, because humans had never shown signs of such technology, much less the ability to send signals like this through folded space. And worse, when they tried to triangulate the source of the message, they realized it wasn't coming from a place in space, it was coming from a place in time, or rather from many times at once, as if it existed outside the normal flow of cause and effect, arriving now only because it had always been arriving. And across the fleet, engineers noticed something deeply troubling. The frequency of the signal matched the energy burst recorded just before the destruction of the human scout ship years ago, meaning it had been there from the start, hidden, waiting, and now simply becoming clearer. And when a research vessel attempted to trace the energy path backward, it discovered a web of faint signals stretching across the stars, like a net cast through space, each thread pulsing with the same rhythm, each one leading to a different forgotten system, all of which were once visited by human ships, and now every one of those systems showed signs of impossible changes. Planets, with rewritten geology, moons shaped like faces, gas clouds forming spirals that mimicked human fingerprints. And when a small team entered one of those systems, they found something even more disturbing. A derelict station built from materials no known species used, orbiting a dead star, with walls etched with perfect human handwriting that repeated the message, "You erased the record, but not the memory." And the walls pulsed faintly, alive with a warmth that should not have existed in deep space. And when they tried to scan the writing, every ship in the Ilari fleet received a sudden transmission at once, a sharp flash of images and sound too fast to follow. Yet somehow every crew member could recall what they saw. eyes staring from the dark, a broken ship being rebuilt backward, a child reaching out with fire in its hand, and then silence, so heavy it seemed to push against the chest, and for 3 whole minutes, no one in the fleet could speak, move, or breathe, held in place by something unseen, and when it ended, half of the fleet's AI systems refused to reboot, instead displaying only a single symbol, a spiral inside a triangle, not known to Ilari history, but later found carved into one of the human monuments discovered earlier, and now the scientists began to understand that the monuments were not warnings or graves, but markers, points in space where something had happened, something no one remembered anymore, and the realization brought more fear than answers, because if the memory was gone, what else had been erased? And who had done the erasing? And then came the most shocking event. The reappearance of a human vessel, one long believed destroyed in the early wars, now drifting out of a distortion, near the eye with no power, no crew and no damage, as if it had never left. Yet when scanned, its systems showed a temporal signature that defied logic. It had been in flight for over 1 million years, and inside its data core was a single file named in Ilari script, though no human should have known that language, and when opened, the file played a soft lullaby, one that caused every listener to cry without knowing why, and then whispered a new message: the silence was never yours to break. And this message spread, jumping from ship to ship like fire in dry grass, rewriting logs, wiping security, footage, erasing conversations, until even personal memories began to shift, and officers woke up unsure of their names or posts. Engineers forgot how their ships worked, and some no longer recognized their own reflections. And still the signal grew louder, not in volume, but in presence, as though it were becoming part of reality itself, bending the rules that held things in place, and the Yilari Council, in a last desperate act, ordered a fleet-wide shutdown, hoping to purge the signal by removing all digital life for one rotation. But as they flipped the final kill switch, all screens went black, then one by one turned on again, each now showing the same quiet image. A human figure sitting in a room filled with stars, eyes closed, breathing slowly. And beneath the figure were 5 words glowing in the human tongue. "We gave you the stars." And the figure opened its eyes and looked directly at every screen at once, as if it saw every ship, every person, every thought, and then spoke in a voice that was not sound but memory, saying, "And now we take them back." And across the fleet, the stars outside. The windows flickered, not dimmed, but vanished for an instant, replaced by complete nothingness, a perfect void, and though they returned a moment later, the Ilari knew something had changed, something had begun that could not be undone. And somewhere far beyond the eye, beyond the reach of charts or light, something old stirred in the dark, not human and not alien, but something in between, something born from silence and thought, now awake, now listening. The moment the stars flickered, the Ilari knew that their final mistake had already been made, for the brief absence of light was not just a power surge or a glitch in sensors, it was a message, a sign that the shape of the end had already taken form. And now it was simply arriving, silent and certain, like the falling of dusk. And though the fleet scrambled to relocate and hide within the tangled systems of the galactic rim, every jump drive, every navigation program, and even every personal wristpad still showed a faint trace of the human spiral symbol, spinning slowly, as if laughing at their attempts to flee. And no matter how many times the engineers rebooted the systems, the image returned, embedded deeper each time, until finally one ship, the Far Runner, chose to disconnect completely from the network, cutting off all digital ties, isolating its systems, and resorting to manual control. And though this gave the crew a brief moment of peace, that peace was shattered when they noticed that all their paper logs, written by hand and never uploaded, now showed dates that didn't exist, places they had never visited, and worst of all, names of people they had never met, yet somehow recognized. And the captain, a hardened veteran named Lorvek, who had never feared any enemy, began to have dreams of walking through forests made of starlight, where the trees whispered in English and the ground was soft with memory, and every night the dream ended with him finding a mirror inside which he saw himself not as a Yllari, but as a human child reaching up toward a sky filled with spirals, and when he woke, he could still hear the heartbeat, slow and steady, echoing through the walls, and soon other captains reported the same dreams, the same images, the same steady rhythm beneath everything, and it became clear that this was not just infection or sabotage, but something deeper, something old, patient and watching. And then across multiple ships, entire decks began to change, not through damage or invasion, but transformation, walls curving in ways that matched no known design, corridors reshaping into spiral paths that always led back to the same door, a door none of the crew remembered building, with no locks, no seams, and only one word above it: remember. And when the doors were opened, they revealed rooms filled with objects that should not have existed, childhood toys, old Earth books, paintings of skies that no Yllari had ever seen, yet all who entered felt a strange sadness, as if mourning something they had once loved and forgotten. And some crew refused to leave, choosing instead to sit quietly in those impossible rooms until their minds slipped away like pages torn from a book. And when those ships were checked, the ones who had remained were gone, not dead, not missing, just erased. Their records vanished, their quarters empty, their reflections absent in mirrors, and slowly the truth formed. The end was not fire or war, not a weapon or disease, but the unraveling of meaning itself, the undoing of memory, identity, presence. And as the last Yllari council met aboard the fortress ship Vexura, they realized that the real battle was not against something outside, but something within, something now seeded in every thought, every moment of silence. And during that meeting, all the stars outside the viewport disappeared again, this time for 13 full seconds. And when they returned, so did the image of the seated human child, no longer alone, but surrounded by floating fragments, ships, monuments, faces, voices, all gently spinning around him like forgotten thoughts. And then a voice, calm and deep, filled the room. To forget is to survive. To remember is to return. And one counselor, shaking, stood up and whispered, "We don't even know what we did." And the voice answered, "But you tried to erase it." And with those words, the Vexura's systems shut down, not from failure, but from choice, as if the ship itself had decided it no longer wished to be part of what was coming. And outside, in the void beyond light, something moved, massive, formless, slow, and every sensor failed to record it, every eye failed to see it, yet everyone felt it like gravity in the soul, and some fell to their knees without knowing why, while others screamed as pieces of their past vanished mid-thought, and the few humans who had survived, scattered among ancient colonies and hidden stations, began to stir, sensing the return of something once bound, once buried, now awake. And they spoke softly among themselves, not in fear, but in recognition, saying, "It comes for what was stolen." And the end began not with destruction, but with forgetting. Stars blinked out of memory before they blinked out of space. Whole planets ceased to appear on maps. Species who had spoken just moments ago were now never known, and still the spiral spread, not as an attack, but as a question, silent and final. And on the last remaining ship of the Yllari, a single child stood in a room made of light, holding a small stone with human writing, and as the adults wept around him, unable to speak or remember why they feared, the child looked into the spiral and asked the last question: "What were we before we forgot?" And from the void came only one word, written across the sky in lines of fire: truth, and then the shape of the end was complete, not in ruin, but in silence, perfect and whole. There was no sound, no movement, no breath left in the great void, where once 1,000 empires had burned bright. And in the silence after everything, not a single Ilari remained to tell the story, not because they had died, but because the memory of them had been wiped from the stars, their names erased. From time itself and now, where fleets once drifted and cities floated among the clouds, there was only stillness, a soft and waiting hush that seemed to press gently on whatever remained, as if the universe itself were pausing, holding its breath, unsure of what would come next. And in the center of that silence, where the eye had once pulsed with stolen power, now stood something new, or perhaps something very old, a single structure, smooth and black like glass, soaked in shadow, shaped like a perfect spiral, unfolding into the dark. And inside it sat the child, the same child who had appeared again, and again in dreams and images, no longer human in form but still wearing the shape of one, his eyes closed, his hands resting on his knees, and around him floated tiny fragments of memory, flickering like sparks, whispers, songs, laughter, rain pages from books no longer written, gently turning through the air like dust in light. And he was not alone, for with him were the echoes of what had once been. Quiet figures moving through rooms that didn't exist, speaking words that no one remembered, each one acting out a moment, a choice, a history. And though none could be heard, it was clear they were telling something important, something that had once mattered greatly and now mattered more. And beyond the black walls of that spiral tower, space itself had grown strange, not dead but different, as though it were healing from a wound too deep to see, and from far-off corners of forgotten galaxies, the last remaining traces of humanity began to stir, not in anger or sorrow, but with quiet understanding, their blood carrying the signal of what had passed, not as a curse, but as a warning. That silence is not the end but the cost, and in one such place, deep beneath the crust of a sleeping moon, a girl awoke with no name but a memory of a ship burning, of voices crying, and of a message whispered through static. And when she opened her eyes, she saw stars she did not recognize but felt she should, and her first words were, "Where are we now?" And when the AI that answered her sounded old and tired, and said only "after," and that was all she needed to know, because she understood then that the world before was gone, not destroyed but removed, peeled back like paint, to reveal the raw wall beneath. And she wandered that moon for many days, before she found a stone with markings she didn't know how to read. But her hands traced it slowly, and tears came without reason, because even though the words were silent, they spoke of loss and hope, and something sacred, something once broken, and now beginning again, and far across the sky, on a dead station, orbiting a nameless star. An old robot began to move, its gears grinding to life after centuries of stillness, and it carried within it a single preserved sound file, a human song, soft and full of longing. And as it played it quietly to itself, the air around it shimmered, and light formed into patterns that no longer fit the rules of physics, and all across the remains of the galaxy, these little sparks of memory stirred, not powerful, not fast, but steady, like seeds falling into soil that had never known life. And no one knew who had first sent the signal, or what the true shape of the end had been. But those who remained, scattered and hidden, began to gather the pieces, not to rebuild the past, but to understand it, to learn from it, to remember that forgetting was not always peace, and silence was not always safety. And as years passed in this new silence, whispers began to return, not voices of the lost, but voices of the new, the children of survivors asking questions, wondering why the stars looked different, why the old machines dreamed of ships and spirals. And in their wondering, a new story began to grow, not one of conquest or fear, but one of curiosity and care. And in that black spiral tower at the center of all things, the child finally opened his eyes and stood, and as he looked out over the silent stars, he smiled, not with joy, but with quiet certainty, for he knew the cycle had ended, and something else could now begin. Something better, shaped not by fire or pride, but by understanding, and in that moment the silence no longer felt empty, but full, with meaning, with memory, with the promise that some truths cannot be buried forever, and some songs, once sung, echo forever through the stars.